So I've started recording. And Julian, where are you?
So for the audience, when it says recording, you just press continue, just to show that you agree with it.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Good.
All right. So Julian, you're on. You have it. You have the screen. And Karen, it's all yours.
Okay. Oh, hello, Paul. Paul Barrett.
Hi.
He's an honorary professor of politics at University of New England, and he just got an honorary doctorate. As well. So well done for that, Paul.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Okay. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce Julian McKinlay King. I met Julian a few years ago, and I'm just turning off something on my phone so it doesn't disturb us. And I was struck by his passion for the cause of the long-suffering West Papuan Indigenous people who've experienced so many terrible things since being taken over by Indonesia in the 1960s. And that's a concern that I have shared for over 30 years myself as an activist in Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific and as a researcher on this topic a while ago, though I haven't been working on it recently. Julian also works on the struggle by the Indigenous Kanaks in New Caledonia for independence, and he presented a paper on that in Noumea last year at the Pacific Islands Political Studies Association conference in Noumea. And Julian also has been working on the new state of East Timor, and he has spent extended periods there doing field work on that research topic. But now he's working on West Papua, and he's a PhD candidate enrolled at the University of Wollongong doing his thesis on this topic, which he just started this year, I think. And but having said that, Julian has already published 2 articles on this topic. I'll just mention them briefly for people who watch the recording later. One is West Papua Exposed in the Griffith Journal of Law and Human Dignity, and the other is A Soul Divided in the Portal Journal of Multidisciplinary International Studies. So I'm sure if anybody wants to read either of those articles, they can easily Google them and find them. Now, before we begin Julian's presentation, I just have a few points of housekeeping. One is that during Julian's lecture, it would be, I'd like to ask you to mute your microphones. So your microphone is down in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and you just click on mute. And you can leave it on mute during the discussion as well, and just unmute it when you want to speak yourself. After his lecture, there'll be time for questions and comments, and that's when you can unmute your microphone if you want to speak. Otherwise, we can hear background noises in people's homes. It's also been recommended when there is a reasonably large group of people to turn off the video as well during the lecture part of the presentation. Apparently it can make the video and PowerPoint work a bit better if we do that. I might leave mine on in case Julian and Johanna might leave hers on in case Julian needs assistance with anything at some point. And when we get to the discussion period, there's a function in the middle of your screen at the bottom called Participants. And if you click on that, there's an option in the bottom left-hand corner, which is Raise Hand or the blue hand. And if you want to speak or make a comment in the discussion after the lecture part of the presentation, you just have to put your blue hand up and we'll be able to see it in the corner of your video. And I suggest that we turn the videos back on for the discussion so Julian can see who he's talking to. All right, so that's the end of the housekeeping. A final comment, Julian's presentation today is extremely topical. Things have been getting a lot worse in West Papua in the last 2 years. And this very week, we've had 3 mentions of it in Australia. One is that the ABC Foreign Correspondent TV program did a feature on West Papua this week, which I'm sure you'll be able to find on Catch Up. And this morning in the conversation, an Australian research team has published an article giving an update on West Papua and telling about how they're going to map the deaths in West Papua since it was taken over by Indonesia. And finally, next week, John Martinkus is going to launch his 2nd book on this topic. The last one was, I think, about 20 years ago, and it was an excellent book. And now he's going to launch an update on that. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Julian. Thank you so much for joining us, Julian, from sunny Yarunga. I wish we all wish we were there. And look, we've got lots more people have joined us during my introduction, so I'm glad they didn't miss out on anything you have to say. And so, yeah, please begin, Julian, on the origins of the West Papuan genocide.
Well, thank you, Karen, very much, and Joe and UNE for giving me this opportunity. Good morning, Stephen, my supervisor, who's just joined us as well. I'll share the screen now, and I'll go through a set of slides and commentary. Let me see now. Can you see the screen? Hello?
Not yet, Julian. Just go down to the green button, share screen.
Oh dear.
No, you'll be all right. It worked before. The joys of Zoom.
All right. Now, share screen.
Yep. And your PowerPoint, like we did earlier. There you go. And put it on slideshow.
There we go.
Perfect.
Up and running. Okay.
Yeah, you can see it. It's great.
So here we are. We're looking at the issue of West Papua and origins of the West Papuan genocide. This is not my topic of research, really. I'm looking at the ongoing war between the West Papuan people, represented by the OPM, the guerrilla forces that have been fighting the Indonesian military since the mid-60s. And as Karen said, it's been escalating dramatically in the last couple of years, particularly with the advent of this new road, which is what John Martinkus's book is about, coming out next week, I believe. I'll go through a bit of background information. First of all, the island of Papua is just immediately north of Australia. It's about 200 kilometres. And West Papua is on the western side of that island, divided along the 141 parallel. The people are Melanesian. They're distinctly different from people in Indonesia. And they're, of course, related to Papua New Guineans, Solomon Islanders, Vanuatuans, Kanakis or New Caledonians, and Fijians. The island was divided along the 141 meridian in the 1800s, with the Netherlands claiming the western side and the Germans and the British claiming the eastern side. After World War I, it became an Australian protectorate and then a non-self-governing territory as West Papua became a non-self-governing territory of the Netherlands. The Pacific War came along, and the West Papuans were our allies. They fought alongside us. This is an amazing group called the Oak Tree Party, led by Dr. Brun, a young Dutch member of the administration who stayed on with his West Papuan colleagues to fight the Japanese. So the West Papuan people fought very courageously. You would know about the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels and so forth, helping the troops get back from the front line when they were shot. Because of their support, General MacArthur made West Papua his headquarters for the Pacific War. And during the US occupation of West Papua, over 500,000 troops went through West Papua fighting the Japanese. After the war, as I say, it became again a non-self-governing, or rather registered under the Charter, it was a non-self-governing territory of the Netherlands, and they were preparing the country for independence. And so was Australia. And so in 1957, the Netherlands and Australia released a joint statement where they recognised the inalienable rights of the inhabitants in accordance with the Charter, i.e. self-determination and independence. And they recognised that the people were ethnologically related. And they set up their administrations to coordinate their administrations until the habitants were in a position to determine their own future, with the idea being that they could eventually emerge as one nation on the island of Papua. The Dutch supported the independence movement, and the West Papuans embraced it. In December, they formed the New Guinea Council, and that was a regional body representing the West Papuan people. And then within that, there was any number of regional councils representing the diverse language groups and cultural groups. And within those regional councils, they had village councils. So it was very much a decentralized, autonomous system of governance, quite unique, but reflecting the indigenous character of the Melanesian people. However, we find also at the same time in 1959, this is now declassified former secret Department of State US document, and we find that the Department of State has changed their policy, and they've decided that it's in the best interests of America if West Papua was to become part of Indonesia. And the reason this occurred was because the Netherlands administration had just released a document saying that they were about to explore for alluvial gold draining from the mountains on the southern coast of West Papua. And some of the American corporations knew about this already, and they were eager to get their hands on the gold. And they realized that it would be easier if it was part of Indonesia rather than becoming an independent West Papuan nation or a Papuan nation with the eastern side. They coerced the Netherlands to sign an agreement with Indonesia, and this agreement was signed in 1962, and it transfers the territory first to the United Nations, and then it transfers the territory at the discretion of the United Nations to Indonesia. However, according to the UN Charter, the only way that the Netherlands can release responsibility over this territory, according to Article 73E, is when the territory becomes a trust territory. And so in a previous paper, I and my colleague Andrew Johnson argue that West Papua should have become a trust territory of the United Nations. And as a trust territory, according to Chapter 12 of the Charter, the only option for that territory is independence. Furthermore, this agreement was never approved by the General Assembly, which must be done. It was only noted. And under the rules of the General Assembly, taking note neither approves nor disapproves of a particular report or an agreement. And furthermore, this agreement is between Indonesia and the Netherlands, and yet the territory is transferred to the United Nations. So the whole thing is, we argue, is illegal. Now, this agreement, 6311, was tabled before the General Assembly for debate and approval. As I say, it wasn't approved. However, on the same day, there was a second agreement signed. It's not working. And this agreement was Agreement 6312, and it's between the United Nations, Indonesia, and the Netherlands. However, it was only published a year later in the list of treaties, and it's registered as ex officio. Now, while it's quite a small agreement, what this agreement does do, it transfers sovereignty from the Netherlands to the United Nations. And this really should have been put before the UN for debate and discussion. And it should have gone before the Trusteeship Council, which is responsible for the administration and oversight of trust territories. So we argue that West Papua remains a non-self-governing territory, which has been abandoned by the Netherlands and then, if you like, invaded or taken up by the United Nations and then consequently Indonesia. So the UN arrived in 1962, much to the anger of the West Papuan people. They realized that they'd been sold out. They protested, but of course nothing came of it. When the Indonesians took over on the 1st of May 1963, they rounded up anyone who was supportive of independence, and the United Nations Secretariat flew out the night before. So when Indonesia took over on the 1st of May, there was not a single UN representative remained in the territory, which was part of that agreement. They were supposed to stay on and assist Indonesia in the act of self-determination, and that didn't occur. We see from, again, now released secret US Department of State documents. If we read the first paragraph, we can see that the biggest or off-cited grievance of the West Papuans is that the Indonesians cleaned out the shops and storehouses in the period immediately following their takeover of West Irian in '63. Missionaries reported that they had witnessed Indonesian military personnel loading up Air Force planes at night with goods taken from local stores. And after a couple of months, there was an acute shortage of food. In the same report by Galbraith, we see that the Americans recognize that the majority of West Papuan people, they say 85 to 90%, are in sympathy with the Free Papua movement, or the OPM, and that they intensely dislike the Indonesians. So the Western world knew quite well that this was going against the wishes of the West Papuan people. And indeed, the Act of Free Choice saw Indonesia handpick 1,026 people out of a population of close to 1 million, which represents around 0.1%. And that Act of Free Choice was supposed to follow international norms and standards. So the whole thing was a sham, and there's been many, many papers written to describe this, which we won't go into today. So that's the background. So I'm looking at the case for genocide, which has been looked at multiple times before, but more I'm looking at the origins. Why does Indonesia have such a reputation for being brutal and extreme, which is what I've come across through my readings on the topic? So the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1948 recognizes 5 methods of genocide. Either one will do, and it has to be committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part the national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And West Papuans are a national group, distinct ethnical group, distinct from the people of Java and the rest of Indonesia. So killing members of the group is considered genocide, causing serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting on groups conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, preventing the births within the group, and forcibly transferring children away from the group to another group. So I'll just run through a few examples of these issues. So a report from Reuters shows that this war is going on. The Indonesian army has slaughtered thousands of primitive tribesmen in an unreported war in West Irian. This is from Otto Ondawame's book, One People, One Soul, who did his PhD on the history of the OPM, the Free Papua movement. And as you can read here, the atrocities, the way that they inflict terror amongst the people, and the mass killings, 43,000 people murdered in the area of Freeport. This is in the 70s when the American mining company was moving in to mine what has become the world's largest gold deposit. Mass killings, we have the case of the Biak massacre. This is in 1998. Now in 1998, we just had the fall of the dictator Suharto, and right across the Indonesian archipelago, people were starting to stand up and realize that the yoke of oppression was being lifted. They are witnessing East Timor get its independence, and other people started to protest, and of course the West Papuans. So on this particular day, the people raised the Morning Star flag above the water tower here in Biak. And after about 24 hours or so, the military arrived. They surrounded the people, several hundred, and they just massacred them. They then went house to house, rounded up everybody they could find, who they thought was involved, loaded them onto military ships, took them out to sea, stripped the women naked, raped them, tortured them, mutilated their bodies, and bodies were washed up on the islands for days to come. This was reviewed at the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. We had a citizens' tribunal overseen by John Dowd, and we had victims fly in to give their testimonies and their accounts. Mass arrests, common. We see here a report in 2016. They say the latest round of mass arrests brings to well over 5,000 the number of people arrested in Indonesia for peaceful demonstrations in support of West Papuan self-determination. This is more recent, in January 2020. This is the current ongoing sweeping operations, particularly in the highlands around the military, around the Freeport mining operation. Back in January, there was an estimated 50,000 people displaced. Now it's well over 70,000, with people even making the enormous journey across to Papua New Guinea to come in as refugees to escape the oppression. New Zealand, Radio New Zealand reports shallow graves being discovered in Duga, women and children being murdered by the Indonesian military, presumably. And a lot of people have been living in caves and makeshift dwellings. Exposure and malnutrition is killing the elderly and the young. And an amazing report from investigative journalist Michael Bachelard in 2014 with the Sydney Morning Herald. He shows us how the Indonesian regime is taking young children, as young as 5, aboard military planes and taking them across to Java to be indoctrinated into fundamentalist Islam behind bars. And his reports are quite amazing. Some of these children managed to escape, and with the support of West Papuans living in Jakarta, managed to make their way back to West Papua. But this is a program, and it's sponsored by the ruling elite. Michael Bachelard documents where politicians will sponsor these children, thinking that they're doing them some great service. And as Karen mentioned, it's like the stolen generation in Australia. This is the World Bank sponsored transmigration program, and I would suggest that this is also another method of genocide. The World Bank has brought over approximately 1 million people from Java, predominantly Java and Madura, and they bulldoze these massive areas and build these enormous camps for the transmigration people. Each of these dots is a house. They're given agricultural equipment, livestock, and they're set up for life while the West Papuans are marginalized and forced to move further into the jungles. We see from ABC News, this was the last presidential elections, and this is a paramilitary group called Pancasila Youth. It has 3 million members reportedly, and they back the different candidates. They're basically thugs for hire, which support the politicians and the military. and an amazing documentary by Joshua Oppenheimer called The Act of Killing, made in 2012. And he actually videos the former vice president of the time at a meeting, a member of this Punkasila paramilitary youth. And he quotes him saying, "We need gangsters to get things done." The Indonesian military receives 25% of its income from the government. And according to Peter King's book, in 2004, they generate 75%, or US 2 billion, is derived from extortion, black market operations, logging interests, mining interests, and the like. The last election was a contest between the current President Widodo and General Prabowo. Prabowo is the son-in-law of the former dictator Suharto. And Prabowo reveals to investigative journalist Alan Nairn, "Do I have the guts? Am I ready to be called a fascist dictator?" We also see in Democracy Now! By Alan Nairn that had Prabowo won the election, he had planned to set up another US-backed military dictatorship. But instead, Widodo won the competition, and Widodo appointed him Minister of Defence. And he also appointed General Wiranto to his cabinet. And you might remember General Wiranto was indicted by the United Nations in East Timor for war crimes. However, the East Timor government did not pursue the prosecution. But Wiranto is also wanted for war crimes. And there's a good line here: "When he left East Timor, try to picture this: almost every man, woman and child forced from their homes, often at gunpoint, usually because of the sheer terror. Entire towns and villages turned into wastelands, everything of value stolen and loaded onto trucks by the military police and their anointed thugs." So they took out whatever they could with them when they left East Timor. And you might remember the common sign saying, "You will eat rocks if you want independence." And that was their policy. Stephen Hill, in his book, Captives for Freedom, he was in a unique position working as the head of UNESCO in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, and based in Jakarta. And he says the military has had a long-standing policy of penetration right down to street or kampung village level in security and community involvement. Where I lived in Jakarta, for example, the street where I resided was monitored and managed by an ex-military non-commissioned officer who reported to his former military masters. This practice was universal. And I can add to this from my several years working in Indonesia, in Borneo and Sumatra. I worked with a US-owned gold mining operation, exploration program, and the CEO, or the president rather, of the company told me that we had 2 Indonesian generals on the board of directors in order to operate. Without having the military on your side, without paying them, you do not operate. You cannot get licenses, nothing will happen. And I heard stories from my Dayak friends in Borneo where the military would come through and massacre the local people to make way for mining and logging operations. I was in Sumatra in the 90s and I came across the military going around hunting tigers. There are obviously an endangered species, the Sumatran tiger, but the military were hunting them to export and to sell them. And when I was in Sumbawa, I heard about massacres when Newmont was setting up its mining operations. Again, the military would come out and shoot the indigenous people who were opposing their activities. Peter King quotes General Raikudu in his book in 2014. Like it or not, the glue of the nation nowadays is the Indonesian military. If people want to dismantle the state, go ahead and abolish the territorial units. If the Trokora military command in Irian Jaya, that's West Papua, were dissolved, West Papua would be independent tomorrow. So they know full well that they are the glue that is stopping the self-determination of the people of West Papua. Budi Hernawan, an academic from West Papua, and he's asking the question, why does Indonesia kill us? And he's looking at the assassinations of the West Papua National Committee. And he concludes, killing is not an end in itself. Rather, it is carefully designed to infuse a message of terror amongst the targeted community, the Papuans. A Yale Law School report back in 2004 looks at the case of genocide, and they conclude the historical and contemporary evidence set out above strongly suggests that the Indonesian government has committed prescribed acts with the intent to destroy the West Papuans as such, in violation of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment for the Crime of Genocide. A similar report came out a year later at the University of Sydney at CPAX with the same conclusions. And a bit more recently, Jim Elmsley and Cami Webb-Gannon looked at the issue of intent, which is a very important issue. The government must show intent, and they conclude that intent was indeed part of their strategy. So the origins of oppression, where did it come from? How did it start? And we have to go back to World War II, the Pacific War. So while the Japanese were the enemy of the West Papuan people on the island of Papua, Sukarno embraced the Japanese. He saw them as being liberators. And we see here in a report from The Nation, the Japanese found it very hard to find collaborators, and finally they seized on Sukarno. And he was the principal collaborator. He was extorting the resources from the archipelago to support Japan's war effort. He was a friend of the Emperor Hirohito, and in 1943, he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun for his great work, outstanding service. In 1944, the Allies were getting close, and so the Japanese trained 1.5 million Javanese in preparation for the invasion. And when the Allies arrived, they found themselves not fighting against Sukarno and a few nationalists, they found themselves fighting against Black Fan Japanese terrorist organizations. And we see in an article from 2009, where they interviewed some of these old Japanese soldiers in Indonesia, and they explain how well over 1,000 Japanese soldiers deserted and stayed on to lead the Indonesian military, and their contribution has not been appreciated by either the Japanese or the Indonesian governments. And Sukarno too, he was greatly influenced by the Japanese. While he started off as a democratic centralist or centralized democracy in 1933, according to Bernard Dahm, 1969, he shifted his ideology when he realized the effectiveness of directly transmitted when he observed the effectiveness of directly transmitted orders, and he saw himself as the Führer, as the new fascist leader, if you like, of Indonesia. This is the Hague Agreement. So eventually the Dutch and the Indonesians set about separating. They had three agreements: the Lingataki Agreement, the Renville Agreement, and finally the United Nations brokered Hague Agreement. And the Hague Agreement established the Federal Republic of the United States of Indonesia, and plebiscites were supposed to be conducted in the various states as to whether or not those states wanted to join the United States of Indonesia. And if they didn't, they had the option to negotiate a special relationship with Indonesia or the Netherlands. So a few months later, 6 months later, Sukarno, the Dutch had left, and Sukarno simply announced a centralized rule, effectively a dictatorship. And the plebiscites, the United States, were simply ignored, breach of the Hague Agreement. We hear now in 1952, several years after independence, there are still rebel groups right across the archipelago in Sumatra, in Borneo, and this report is about the South Moluccan government. And we read that rebels are fighting the Indonesians with tanks, and what's more, led by the Japanese. And indeed, further into this article, it describes how the Japanese are driving the tanks and massacring the indigenous Moluccans. So who's responsible? Who can be responsible is people committing genocide, and in this case, people who are complicit in genocide. And those people that can be held responsible are leaders, officials, and private individuals. We see here Australia, I believe, can be deemed complicit because we support the Indonesian military. We supplied helicopters which were used in the crackdown in the 1970s, along with America, who supplied Bronco jets. We also trained the Indonesian military in Australia. Against the TNI, the Indonesian military, 2 years ago, which takes us back to 2014, and that was looking into East Timor. ABC News reports Papuans claim Australia link to death squads. This is the Australian created and trained detachment 80 to Victor Yemo. They are notorious for extrajudicial killings, not just in West Papua, but right across the Indonesian archipelago. Germany is part of it. They have sold over 100 tanks to Indonesia in recent years. The British are also involved. They have resumed weapons sales because of the huge opportunities, business opportunities. And of course, America. And here in 2018, they have granted, free of charge, 24 F-16 fighters. And at the fall of Suharto, we see from the National Security Archives, secret archives reveal that even when Suharto was falling, the United States promoted close ties to the Indonesian military rather than supporting the emergence of democracy. The invasion by the Japanese Imperial Army led to the birth of fascism in Indonesia and manifests as genocide in West Papua. Around 1.5 million Javanese were trained with at least 1,000 Japanese commandos to create the new Indonesian Republican Army. The Lingataki, Renville and Hague agreements were breached, denying self-determination for the people of the Dutch East Indies, and that remains until this day. And Indonesia, of course, became the Republic rather than the United States of Indonesia. And of course, they are supported by the Western powers, complicit in genocide. And I would argue without the support of the Western powers, Indonesia would collapse tomorrow, just as Rayakudu said in his statement regarding the glue of the Indonesian military. Corporate benefactors. There are many corporate benefactors in West Papua. There are multiple international mining companies, but for today's short presentation, I'll just look at Freeport and give a quick overview. Freeport came into West Papua in 1967-68. This is before the Act of Free Choice. So as soon as Suharto came to power in 67, he granted a mining license to the American mining giant. As a geologist, I estimate there has been at least $2 trillion taken out worth of gold out of West Papua, possibly double that, could be $4 trillion. It's the world's largest gold deposit, and it's been going for around 50 years now. Looking at fascism, what is fascism? It's a very highly contested definition, but I like this definition from Mussolini. Fascism should be more appropriately be called corporatism. It is the merger of state and corporate power, and we saw that with Hitler back in his reign. So, theoretical framework. I'm looking at Michael Mann's theory on modern day genocide. He calls it the dark side of democracy. Others consider that genocide is committed by dictators, which of course West Papua Indonesia may be deemed to be, but of course they can't survive without so-called democratic governments who are behind them and who are benefiting from the exploitation of the resources. And I also like C. Wright Mills. He wrote the book The Power Elite back in 1958, looking at the CIA, and Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, and how they were working as Wall Street lawyers, heading up the CIA and the State Department and facilitating America's takeover of other people's resources, plotting to kill democratic elected leaders and putting up dictators. Henry Kissinger, I think, is a great example. He's been described as genocidal in Vietnam, Cambodia, and many other countries. And I would argue that he is also complicit in West Papua. He was the former Secretary of State. He was on the board of directors of Freeport. He was an advisor to the Indonesian government, and he was also in East Timor just before the invasion with Gerald Ford. So in summary, Indonesia is yet another case of US and Western foreign policy supporting oppressive regimes over democracies to get access to cheap resources. The indigenous peoples and their ecosystems are being wiped out simply for the benefit of the power elite and their corporate masters. West Papua remains an abandoned non-self-governing territory, illegally occupied by Indonesia, and there's no accountability, and international law is not being upheld. In the case of West Papua, not only Indonesia, but more importantly, Western governments, I believe, need to be held to account. And I believe the way the world is going with this ongoing movement, it would seem that we're seeing a re-emergence of fascism in Indonesia and elsewhere. That's my slides for today.
Thank you very much, Julian. That was a great presentation. You can unshare your screen with the slideshow now. So you go back down to that green button and unshare it. So we don't want to see your computer. We just want you to undo the unshare.
Okay. Yeah.
So you go to the green button at the bottom of the middle of the screen.
It's not there, I'm afraid.
Joanna, can you put on your microphone and tell him what to do? You're still muted, Joanna. Oh, there you go.
No, it takes a minute. I'm just going to take back host.
Yes, great, Joe.
Okay. Is that okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
please do.
Okay. Hang on. Just 1 second. It seems to have a delay. Hang on. Bear with me. Now, oh, here we are. Okay. So, Julian, just minimize your screen, please.
Yep.
Can you just close your screen out? Just press that.
I think I have.
No, it's still there.
Oh, hang on. Here we are. What do I need to do? Stop share?
Yes, please.
Okay, here we go.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well
Now
done.
it is.
We're all going to be Zoom professionals at the end of lockdown.
Okay.
People want to be seen. They can be seen now for the purposes of discussion. If you want to speak and get in a queue, you can do the blue hand, which is in participants at the center of the bottom of your screen. Or if you think that's too hard, you can just wave and we'll probably wave your hand physically and we'll probably see you if you don't want to go through the blue hand method. But I might kick off. Julian, that was a very wide-ranging and informative presentation on the whole history of the Indonesian takeover of West Papua and how Indonesia the government, the military, and the foreign companies they've allowed in there have behaved in the time since then. And you've talked about the illegality of what happened. You've talked about the human rights abuses and the atrocities. I'd be interested to hear what you believe to be the way forward. I mean, I know we have the OPM and we have a much broader social movement in West Papua in favour of independence, but what do you believe are the next steps in progressing this situation, either in terms of human rights or independence, or both?
Well, both. The people want independence and they're entitled to. And as we've seen from the early reports, they were just about there when America changed its foreign policy. So it's a legal argument as much as anything else. I think we need to find a legal pathway to the International Court of Justice. I've proposed a couple of avenues in my earlier papers where any member of the UN can put this item on the agenda of the Trusteeship Council. That's because under the rules of the Trusteeship Council, if there is any breach of the international trusteeship system, then they have to seek a legal opinion from the International Court of Justice. Furthermore, any member of a territory which believes that there's been a breach of the international trusteeship system can put a petition to the Trusteeship Council. So that's one legal avenue that we can have the issue addressed, and it needs to go before the ICJ because there's no competent court, I believe, in Indonesia that can deal with the issue.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience? Yes, DB.
Hi, Julian. Very interesting presentation. Thanks for that. My question is just kind of follow from Karin's question, actually. West Papua is not, as far as I understand, on the UN decolonization list because
Correct.
there are many from the South Pacific and Pacific Island countries, but it was always escaped that very important list. So I think there is the complication of gaining independence because there's no legal international support, at least coming from the United States. So my question is, to the date I understand, the support for West Papuan case comes from outside of Indonesia, to some extent from Asia, in Southeast Asia, and also from the European countries. So are you familiar with any kind of, the local movement within Indonesia, how far Indonesian people support this West Papuan case, and if in what capacity? I understand they might not prefer to see West Papua being an independent nation. So in this case, would right to self-determination rather than the full independence be an option? That's what I have seen elsewhere. For example, in Sri Lanka, sort of a similar case was there with LTT, but currently I think the Tamils have given up the idea of a separate state independence, and now they are negotiating for right to self-determination with bigger and better political autonomy. And that seems to be sort of moving to a certain direction. Do you think that would be a possibility, and would creating a momentum within Indonesia to support West Papuan case, do you think that could also help towards improving the situations in West Papua?
Thank you, DB. To address the first part, yes, there is a movement within Indonesia itself, Indonesians in Java and elsewhere who support the West Papuan cause. They realise that what's going on is absolute oppression, but they also realise the Indonesian military are oppressive, not just in West Papua, but right across the archipelago, as I saw when I was over there years ago, as we saw in the case of East Timor. So there is a growing movement, and there's been people arrested, Javanese people locked up. There's one person locked up right now for treason for protesting peacefully in Jakarta to support West Papua. Indonesia has already given what they call special autonomy to West Papua to try to address this issue. This was their token gesture. However, it hasn't worked. The money that's been pouring in to support the autonomy position has been taken up by local officials. Corruption is rife. The transmigration program continues. The military sweeping operations continue. I think we need to see that Indonesia is still really a military dictatorship. It's a leftover from World War II. So while the Germans were put before the Nuremberg trials and hung or imprisoned for their fascist atrocities, and the Japanese were as well, we need to see this in Indonesia. We need to see people like General Wiranto, Raya Kudu, all of them held to account for their gross human rights violations. And we need to see that the people in Indonesia are also given the opportunity for self-determination. So I don't see there's an opportunity at the moment to have a autonomy or a special deal in West Papua.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Paul, you need to unmute your microphone. It's on the bottom left-hand corner.
You've got a bunch of people with their hands raised there. Karen, I'm one of them, but there are 3 ahead of me.
I have a blue hand, Karen.
Oh, is that somebody I can't see? Who is it?
It's Richard Jones. I think you can see my face.
Yeah, I can't see the blue hand though. Okay, maybe Joanna can see it and not me. Okay, will you go first then, Richard?
Julian, thank you. It's a unique perspective that I really appreciate. I'm wondering, quick comment and 2 questions, very quick. Have you looked at Timor-Leste's Chaga Truth and Reconciliation report, where we get the stories of individual people and how they suffered and so on, which seems to be quite systematic with the Indonesian military? Secondly, I've been very interested, I've worked in Timor-Leste and grew up in Papua New Guinea, in the incentivisation of local militias. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about how they are incentivised. Of course, that was devastating in Timor-Leste after the referendum. Much of the massacres and so on were done by the local militias. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about the West Papuan local militias. The third thing is, just if you know, I've always heard that the generals can own private companies, the Indonesian generals in East Timor. And this mix of sort of military and corporate interests seems to be, if I'm right, driving a lot of the atrocities that are occurring.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I spent 5 years in East Timor, actually, doing my doctoral research in 1999 to 2004, looking at the United Nations program. So yeah, I'm pretty familiar as well with what happened. And yes, it is indeed a parallel. You've got the militia groups, the Merah red and white militia were very prominent, as you'll remember, in East Timor. And those same militia groups are now in West Papua. You've also got Muslim extremist groups coming over to West Papua, setting up jihadist bases in preparation. They realise that West Papua is going down the same path as East Timor has gone. And so they're starting to prepare and shore up their forces up in Wamena in the highlands. About a month ago, there was Merah militia groups mixed up with military in plain clothes, going house to house, searching for West Papuans to murder. So it's definitely a major concern, and it is very much the same situation as we saw in in East Timor. And what they're scared about is, as they did in East Timor, they're scared that West Papua will be it will be the catalyst for the breakup of Indonesia. And that's the biggest thing the military fear, is the breakup of their patch of the world for looting and pillaging.
Any comment about the generals and ownership, the relationship, I guess, between the corporate interests and the military interests? Yes,
as I say, when I was a young geologist working in central Borneo in Kalimantan for Indo-Muro Kencana, it was an American oil company which was getting into gold mining, and it was just a very simple exploration camp way out in the middle of the jungle. And as the president of the company informed me one day over a bottle of scotch, Mark Miller from Texas, he said, "Julian, if you have any problems with these locals, we've got 2 generals on the board of directors and they'll be over here in no time." And as he said to me, you cannot operate in Indonesia without having generals on your board of directors. Without paying them, you will not get licenses to operate. So it's very much hand in hand, military generals with Western corporate interests.
Thank you.
So is Tony Calladine next in the queue then?
Thank you, Julian, for a very interesting talk there. As I understand, Indonesia has a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. Do you think that Indonesia will support a UN-sanctioned investigation into the human rights abuses? That's part 1 of the question. Part 2 is the Indonesian military retain influence, as you say, in the country, and a very strong influence. How difficult will it be to hold the military commanders that are suspected of human rights abuses to account?
Yes. Sorry, what was the first part of your question? The Human Rights Council. Yes. This is if you look at who is on that Human Rights Council committee, I haven't got the list in front of me, but you will see that many of those countries are countries who are committing gross human rights violations. And this is just a tactic, I believe, to try and divert attention and stop any meaningful investigations into their countries, because they know full well that they're committing human rights abuses. The Indonesian government, even though they promised to allow the Human Rights High Commissioner to come in, she hasn't been able to get in for 3 or 4 years. Foreign diplomats have applied to visit. International journalists, they keep the whole door closed. So regarding accountability, of course, the Indonesian generals are not going to put themselves before a Nuremberg trial or a Jakarta trial. So it's really up to the international community to put pressure on Indonesia. And I think we saw the case in East Timor. It just became too obscene. We had Max Stahl's amazing footage get out of the Dili massacre. And that, I believe, was a turning point that woke up the world to what was going on. And we saw more and more reports coming out of the atrocities in East Timor. And that eventually forced Habibie to recognise that the East Timorese did have a case for independence. Stephen Hill can give us some great insights into that from his time over there during that period. So Indonesia will not go willingly. Therefore, again, it comes down to us, the people, to make it more aware of what's going on, and to also hold our own governments accountable, who, as I say, I believe are complicit in the genocide and the oppression, because we are reaping the benefits. It's our mining companies and oil companies that are extracting trillions and trillions of dollars out of West Papua, not just West Papua, but the whole archipelago. And it's simply for the benefit of the global elite, the 0.1% who own most of our resources. So looking for avenues through the International Court of Justice, I think, is very beneficial, and trying to hold our own leaders to account.
Just a footnote, Julian, with your comparison to East Timor, Timor-Leste, apart from the Dili massacre, one of their strengths was their charismatic, strong leaders, Shanana Guzmao and Jose Ramos Horta. And I think the Indonesians might have learned a lesson for that, because they've been killing the leaders, the most promising leaders of the West Papuan independence movement, namely the peaceful political leader Taze Elaway was murdered. So that gets rid of that problem of charismatic leadership. Paul Barrett, you were waiting in line to...
Thanks, Karen. I was going to make one comment, but I'll now make two. Originally, to go back to the question of legal pathways to bring the situation for the ICC, there's a huge barrier to that acting from Australia, and that is that our foreign policy establishment, not only the proclivities of our government, but our foreign policy establishment will be steadfastly opposed to the creation of any weak state on our borders. And a little bit of history about East Timor, oddly enough, John Howard and Alexander Downer bask in a little bit of glory about being the fathers of East Timorese independence. I can tell you for sure the intent of John Howard's December 1998 letter to Habibie was to bring about a farce like the Act of Free Choice. That letter was designed to consolidate Indonesian control of East Timor once and for all. And remember, we were the only country that recognised Indonesian jurisdiction of East Timor. And but Habibie was such a volatile character. He said, "Okay, have a bloody Act of Free Choice. What do I care?" And you know the rest of that. The second thing about the state of the Indonesian, I just happened to be Secretary of the Defence Department at the time, so I have a few insights into what was going on from our side. Going back to the financial status of the Indonesian military, I recall when I started work in defence in 1966, the Indonesian military had direct access to the oil revenues. Under the Australian Constitution, all revenues of the Commonwealth must be paid into the Consolidated Revenue Fund, and then you can spend nothing without appropriations of the Parliament. The Indonesian military has never been an organisation that was dependent on funding from the administration, even a highly centralised one like Sukarno's administration. It's always had independent sources of revenue, which makes it very much a law unto itself, not only legally, but financially.
Did you want to respond to that, Julian?
Oh, well, I agree. I agree, Paul. They are a law unto their own, and they act with complete immunity. As you saw with Theus Elaway, a couple of people lower down in the ranks, I think, were charged and perhaps imprisoned for a short period. But they do. They act with complete immunity from prosecution. And that's why I say it still is a military dictatorship in Indonesia, with this superficial, sort of thin veneer of quasi-democracy over the top. But the military still act in business, and they can do anything they want.
It's democratic to the extent that the Indonesian military will tolerate it being democratic.
Correct.
A little bit like Myanmar.
Yes. In fact, there's some very good comparisons when we go back to who was supporting Sukarno's claim to West Papua. It was India and Burma, all countries who were essentially dictatorships at the time. And I haven't written about this yet, but basically they thought that if Indonesia was forced to break up, as legally it should have done, to the United States of Indonesia, and West Papua should have been independent, then they were concerned that attention might be placed upon their own so-called nations, which were also oppressing minority groups, indigenous groups.
Stephen Hill, did you have any comments you'd like to make, given you've written a book on this topic?
Excuse me, you're very kind to ask. Needless to say, I've heard and know and respect what Julian's been saying quite a lot, because we've sort of had a lot of conversations. Just one note about East Timor. I actually knew what was going on personally at the time. It was a mistake by Habibie, as a matter of fact, because he was advised by Devi Fortuna Anwar from Living Institute of Sciences, and who said, if you wish to get some kind of perhaps legacy after your presidency, you might do something important, like perhaps grant autonomy to one of the, or offer autonomy to one of the one of the provinces, like Timor and so on. And he said, that's a good idea, and didn't tell anybody. He just decided he'd do it. He didn't tell the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ali Alatas, because I knew him personally. And he said what happened was he saw Habibie walking past his door, and he said, Mr. Habibie, where are you going? He said, I'm going to a press conference to announce the referendum on the independence of East Timor. He got the word independence and autonomy mixed up. And so, in fact, that's how it became a referendum of independence. Habibie wasn't all that bright. As far as my own engagement, it was very personal, because two of my staff were taken hostage by the OPM. We were down there for a number of reasons, but one of them was to try and develop Lawrence National Park as a World Heritage Site. Part of the reason for it was to open up the whole territory of the area of Lawrence National Park to access to people from outside, which didn't particularly happen because, again, the military became involved. We got involved very close to the action of the people. It became extremely clear from personal reports to me that the genocide was going on continuously. So, for example, immediately after we got the hostages out, and that was a whole story in itself, Prabowo came in with what he called the red zone, and he just basically, they killed everybody up in the territory, up around the areas of Mopenduma and so on. So it was very, very clear, and it was very clear the military was in control and maintained that control.
Thank you, Stephen. That's great. I can't remember if Julian had a chance to mention it, but one of the triggers, not to say it's an excuse or a justification, but one of the triggers for the most recent spate of violence by the Indonesian military was because some of the OPM killed a group of road workers linked to the military who were building this massive new road, which, as Julian said, is the subject of John Martinkus' new book being launched next week. And instead of just seeking out the perpetrators of that killing, they simply made punitive raids on whole villages, killing civilians, men, women, and children. So, and that's where the most recent spate of violence began. But that's been going on for nearly a year and a half now, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
Mm. So I think we've gone over time now. If no one else had any final burning questions or comments, I can't see any more blue hands. I finally figured out where they were so I could see them. I'd just like to thank all of you in the audience so much for coming. I know it's a bit strange doing these seminars by Zoom, but it does seem to work.
It works well.
Yeah, I think we've all taken a lot away from Julian's presentation on West Papua and also his responses to the questions and comments. So thank you, Julian, for presenting today. And I know you're only at the beginning of your thesis, but maybe a couple of years down the track, when you're closer to the finishing line, you can tell us about the thesis topic on the OPM war with the Indonesian military, because that sounds fascinating as well. Thank you, everybody.
We're actually halfway through it now, almost halfway through.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank you for your time, everybody. And I'd very much like to catch up with some of you who spoke today. You've got some great perspectives on the topic.
Well, Julian, I know who they are, so you just tell me your hit list and I'll send you their emails.
Good on you, Karen.
Okay, thanks.